All right, so we've got quite a bit to dive into this time.
Yeah.
You sent over a ton of material on expressive arts therapy.
It's a fascinating field.
It is, and we're going to try to cover as much of it as we can in this
Uh,
deep dive for you. So we're going to look at the philosophy behind it, the actual
mhm.
practices, the way therapists are trained, and even how their work is supervised.
Oh, good.
And the goal, as always, is to give you those real key insights, the stuff that'll make you think a little differently about things. And one thing that jumped out right away from all this material
Okay.
is that when we're talking about art in this context, it's not about needing to be like a
Yes.
super skilled artist or anything like that.
Absolutely not.
It's a totally different approach to creativity.
Mhm.
So I'm curious, like, have you ever thought about how something like play or even like
Oh, yeah.
embracing chaos a little bit could actually be a powerful way to understand yourself better
Hmm.
or even work through some tough stuff?
Yeah, your readings really highlight that expressive arts therapy isn't just some random collection of,
Right.
arts and crafts activities.
Yeah.
It's grounded in a really rich philosophical foundation.
Okay. So let's start there then. One of the big ideas that kept coming up was
Uh,
this term poiesis.
Yes, poiesis. It's all about shaping or creating something,
Yeah.
but not in the way we usually think of it. You
Yeah.
know,
Right.
like when you have a specific image in your mind
Yeah.
and you try to impose that onto a material like
Right.
clay or paint or whatever.
Like I'm going to make a vase and it's going to look exactly like this.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in expressive arts therapy, it's more about letting the art emerge organically
Okay.
through this playful exploration of different materials and tools.
So it's more like a back and forth.
It is, yeah, a dance between you and the art form, where
Yeah.
you're kind of surrendering a bit of that control
Mm.
and allowing something new and unexpected to take shape.
Okay, so the key takeaway for me there is it's about the process
Yes.
as much as the product. It's that journey of discovery.
Yeah, and your sources point out that this connection between art and healing,
Mm.
it's not new at all.
Right. It's not some modern invention.
No, no.
Cultures throughout history have recognized this link.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They had this understanding that the body and mind weren't separate entities,
Mm-hmm.
but deeply interconnected, what we now call psychosomatic unity.
Right.
So healing rituals often involve things like music, dance storytelling, these symbolic acts aimed at addressing both the physical and emotional aspects of well-being.
Right. And that's such a contrast to how we often approach things now.
It is, yeah.
Like in modern medicine, the focus is often primarily on the physical, which of
Mhm.
course is important.
Of course.
But your readings also talked about this more recent trend of a sort of detached new age spirituality
Right.
that can sometimes lack that grounding in the physical world.
Yes, and this brings up an interesting point about how we define truth and understanding. Your material introduces Heidegger's concept of aletheia, which can be thought of as unconcealment.
Aletheia. Okay.
Yeah, it's not about whether your opinion matches some external fact,
Okay.
but more about uncovering something that was previously hidden or obscured.
Okay.
Heidegger initially felt that our everyday way of being in the world, often superficial, what he called das Man,
Uh-huh.
or the self.
So.
Yeah, it's like going through the motions without really being present,
Mm.
kept us from this deeper understanding.
Interesting. And then later on, Heidegger shifted his focus a bit
He did.
and started seeing the work of art itself as a primary way this unconcealment happens.
That's right.
He believed that art helps to ground us in the world, and he emphasized this idea of letting be.
Letting be.
Yeah, respecting the mystery of things we can't fully grasp or control.
Right.
So it's almost like the artwork itself has its own wisdom to impart.
Precisely. And that leads us to ancient thinkers like Aristotle, who also grappled with the power of art. In his Poetics, he argued that the poet's knowledge in tragedy isn't just about technical skill.
Mm-hmm.
It requires this profound understanding of human actions and motivations.
Okay.
And a well-crafted tragedy can have a cathartic effect, not just making us sad, but purifying our emotions and leading to a
Interesting.
deeper understanding of ourselves.
Okay, so he's suggesting that engaging with art can have a genuinely healing impact.
Yes. And then you have Nietzsche, who critiques those overly rational ways of seeing the world.
Right.
He talks about tragic poiesis as arising from the interplay between the Dionysian,
Yeah.
that raw, chaotic energy,
Sure.
and the Apollonian, the sense of form and reason.
Oh, he's need both.
Exactly. He argued that tragedy gets its power from this very tension.
Okay.
Without that Dionysian spark, the Apollonian becomes lifeless. But without the Apollonian structure, it's just pure chaos.
It all falls apart.
Exactly.
So bringing it back to expressive arts therapy, poiesis, in this context, isn't about being in complete control intellectually. It's about surrendering to a process that goes beyond our conscious understanding.
Exactly.
And then later on, consciously shaping and refining what emerges.
Yes, it's this dynamic back and forth between letting go and actively working with what comes up.
That makes me think of something else. Your sources mention self-organization or autopoiesis.
Oh, yes.
It's this idea that forms can emerge without someone consciously directing every single step. Kind of like the Taoist concept of wu wei, which is often translated as non-action.
Right.
It's not about literally doing nothing, but more about acting in alignment with the natural flow of things.
Exactly. So in art making, it's about allowing the process to unfold while still being present to guide it, especially in refining the final result.
Okay, so it's kind of like a plant growing.
Yeah, a perfect analogy.
It organizes itself without someone consciously dictating every cell's movement.
Exactly.
Another really fascinating concept your readings explored was liminality.
Liminality, yes.
Drawing on the work of Van Gennep, who looked at rites of passage involving separation, transition, and incorporation. The anthropologist Victor Turner focused on that middle phase, the liminal phase, or the threshold.
The threshold.
Yeah, this is that in-between time, a chaotic period where old structures are breaking down and new ones haven't quite formed yet.
Exactly. It's that feeling of being in limbo.
Right.
A time that can be confusing and even disorienting as old identities are shed and new ones are still forming.
But your sources also highlighted that this can be a really fertile ground for creativity.
Absolutely.
A space where we can explore new meanings and possibilities.
Yes. And within these liminal experiences, Turner identified communitas, this powerful sense of connection.
Communitas.
Yes, this feeling of solidarity
Yeah.
that can arise when people go through these transitional periods together.
It's like that shared experience of being in the unknown.
Exactly.
And it's crucial to remember, as your sources pointed out, that liminality isn't meant to be a permanent state.
Right.
It's a phase in a larger process that eventually leads to a new sense of stability.
Or incorporation.
Exactly. Trying to stay in that state of constant chaos isn't sustainable in the long run.
So how does this apply to the therapeutic context?
Well, it connects beautifully with the idea of tolerating breakdown.
Tolerating breakdown.
Yeah, instead of immediately trying to fix someone or put them back together,
Okay.
there's value in allowing them to experience that fragmentation without rushing to impose a new structure.
So you're saying it's like resisting the urge to immediately bandage a wound
Yes,
and instead allowing the body's natural healing process to begin.
exactly. It's in that space of tolerating the discomfort that new insights and a more authentic sense of self can emerge.
Interesting. Okay, so now your material delves into various psychological perspectives that inform
Yeah.
expressive arts therapy, and the psychoanalytic concept of the unconscious is presented as this paradox.
A paradox.
Yeah, it's this form of knowing that we're not consciously aware of,
Right.
but its influence shows up in our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors.
Exactly. So in this framework, interpretation becomes a key tool for understanding these unconscious traces. And then we have Winnicott's idea of transitional experience, which starts with play and those first transitional objects like a teddy bear.
Yes. He saw this as essential for developing a strong sense of self. And this idea extends to art in adulthood.
Okay.
He stressed the importance of a holding environment, a safe and supportive space,
Right.
and this attitude of letting be from a caregiver or therapist,
Okay.
which allows the true self to develop authentically.
So not feeling pressure to please others or be someone they're not.
Exactly. That can lead to a more inauthentic false self.
Okay, so then shifting gears slightly, Jung's archetypal psychology focuses on our inner world
Yes.
of images and symbols, what he called the imaginal life.
The imaginal life.
Yeah, and a key concept here is dreaming the dream onward.
Dreaming the dream onward.
Actively engaging with our imagination to understand and integrate these archetypal images into our conscious awareness. Now, Hillman's archetypal psychology takes a bit of a different perspective,
It does.
really valuing multiplicity and even seeing what we might call pathology. Those things we label as wrong or unhealthy
Right.
as a process of falling apart that can actually lead to a richer, more diverse inner life.
Yes, he even suggests that maybe wholeness is the disease rather than the cure,
Wow.
emphasizing the importance of the aesthetic dimension of life.
Okay.
The role of beauty and
Yeah.
our sensory experiences as a vital part of healing,
Yeah.
not just intellectual understanding.
So it's about embracing the fullness of experience.
Exactly. Even the parts that might seem difficult or messy.
Okay. And your sources also touch on some postmodern thinkers like Lacan,
Yes.
who famously said the unconscious is structured like a language.
Like a language.
Yeah, and introduced the idea of the mirror stage.
Right.
As this formative but ultimately illusory sense of a stable I.
And then you have Derrida with his idea that the world itself can be seen as a kind of text, constantly being interpreted, which further challenges this idea of a fixed, unified self.
So this brings up a really important point when we consider trauma.
It does.
Because postmodern ideas often embrace fragmentation and uncertainty,
Right.
but trauma can often involve this rigid repetition of the same experience, almost becoming central to someone's identity.
Yes, your readings described it as a kind of negative sublime.
Negative sublime, okay.
To address this, your material revisits Aristotle's concept of catharsis, and it clarifies that it's not just about getting rid of negative feelings,
Okay.
but more about experiencing them in a purified way,
Okay.
leading to a sense of awe and understanding rather than just unhappiness.
So it's like witnessing those difficult emotions without being overwhelmed by them.
Exactly.
And interestingly, your sources question this traditional idea in trauma theory that trauma is just a raw, objective fact that isn't shaped by our individual consciousness.
Right. They emphasize that how individuals experience and interpret traumatic events can vary significantly. Everyone's different.
So this leads to the idea of aesthetic intervention in working with trauma.
Aesthetic intervention.
Yeah, it's about carefully transforming and re-narrating the traumatic story in a sensitive way, rather than just reliving the raw experience.
Right. An aesthetic analysis, paying close attention to what someone creates or says
Right.
after an art-making process, can reveal deeper layers of meaning.
Okay. And your reading even uses the poetry of Paul Celan as an example of how a kind of barbarism,
Yes.
a deliberate breaking down of formal unity, can be a way to speak to unspeakable trauma.
A powerful way.
So therapeutic art making might sometimes need to be a rough art,
You might.
allowing that raw chaos to break through.
Right. And concepts like hybridity and the monster are introduced as ways of unsettling our usual preconceived notions.
It's about shaking things up a bit.
Exactly.
So this whole philosophical exploration really culminates in this idea of aesthetic responsibility.
Aesthetic responsibility.
Yeah, our capacity to respond to the world and actively shape our lives, and engaging in these creative processes, even when it involves letting go of control,
Right.
can be incredibly empowering for people who feel overwhelmed by suffering,
It can.
helping them to regain a sense of agency
Yes.
and the ability to respond to their experiences.
Okay, so now let's shift gears and move into the more practical side of things.
Okay, sounds good.
Your material then delves into the actual practice and training of expressive arts therapists,
Go ahead.
talking about how they facilitate an alternative world experience for clients.
Alternative world experience.
Okay,
Huh.
and what's really interesting here is that this isn't about hypnosis or altered states of consciousness,
Right.
but more about actively using imagination
Okay.
and recognizing the very real presence, the thingliness,
Ingliness.
yeah, of images and objects in art and play.
So you're saying they're not just symbols?
No, they have their own kind of reality.
Okay, and a key technique in this process is decentering.
Centering, yes.
Can you explain a bit more about what that means in this context?
Absolutely. Decentering in expressive arts therapy is about intentionally shifting away from that narrow, logical thinking that often keeps people stuck in their problems.
Okay.
It's about stepping into the more surprising and unpredictable realm of imagination.
So it's like temporarily setting aside your usual problem-focused mindset
Exactly.
to explore things from a different angle.
Right. And your sources mentioned Watzlawick's idea that sometimes the more you focus on a problem,
Right.
the worse it can seem.
Yeah, you just get more and more tangled up in it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So decentering is about creating some distance from that intense focus
Okay.
to open up possibilities for unexpected solutions.
And that sounds closely linked to creativity itself.
Absolutely. Creativity at its heart is about finding new ways to respond to situations, whether they're old or new.
And the words that are used in decentering activities can be incredibly powerful.
Yeah, it can.
Yeah, they can spontaneously lead us into this alternative world of experience, creating a sense of distance from our immediate personal struggles by tapping into archetypal story,
Right.
theatrical roles, or cultural narratives.
It's like saying, for a moment, let's explore what it's like to be the hero in this myth, or to experience this emotion through the lens of this character.
Okay, so it's about stepping outside of yourself for a bit.
Yes.
And it's interesting how art, even with its inherent freedom, often has structures within it.
It does.
Your sources talked about the role of structure in art disciplines.
Yes, even within the freedom of artistic expression, having a well-defined structure,
Okay.
whether it's the form of a poem, the rules of a game, or the conventions of a musical genre,
Right.
can actually provide a safe container for exploring really difficult or chaotic themes.
So the structure itself can feel grounding,
It can.
while the content allows for that exploration.
Exactly.
And this is different from traditional structured coping mechanisms, right?
Precisely. Traditional coping often involves consciously learned strategies. Art-oriented decentering uses a more open, supportive dialogue around the art making, allowing hidden symbols and meanings to emerge organically through the art or play itself.
So it's less about consciously applying a technique
Yes.
and more about allowing those insights to surface through the creative process.
Exactly.
Your material even laid out a kind of architecture for a typical therapy session.
It did.
Can you walk us through that?
Sure, it often starts with an opening where the client connects with their everyday reality.
Okay.
Then there's a bridge that gently guides them into the art-making activity. The art-making itself is where the alternative world experience and decentering happen.
Right.
Afterward, there's aesthetic analysis, where the client and therapist together recognize and reflect on the imaginary reality that's been created.
Okay.
This is followed by another bridge, or harvesting phase, where they connect the insights gained back to their everyday reality. And finally, there's a closing to bring the session to a sense of completion.
It's a journey with a clear beginning, middle, and end.
It is.
So when it comes to actually making art, what about people who don't feel particularly skilled or motivated?
That's a really important point. And your sources stress the importance of using art forms that are culturally relevant and accessible to the client.
Okay.
And crucially, they emphasize that therapy art isn't some separate aesthetic category judged by traditional artistic standards.
It's not about being good at art.
No, not at all.
It's about something else entirely.
Exactly. It could look like all sorts of things.
Yeah.
Art, brute, minimal music,
Yeah.
everyday poetry, even something like poor theater, which focuses on the essential elements of performance.
So it's less about technical skill and more about the engagement with the process itself.
Precisely.
Your readings mention this idea of low skill, high sensitivity.
Yes, instead of focusing on manual dexterity or virtuosity,
Right.
the emphasis shifts to primary aesthetics.
Okay. Primary aesthetics.
Our innate sensitivity to the base qualities of materials. Think about the texture of clay, the sound of a drum beat, the feeling of movement. These basic sensory experiences are what's important.
Okay, so you see this reflected in contemporary Western art forms like art, brute folk art,
Absolutely.
minimal music installation art, and performance art.
Yeah, where the focus isn't always on traditional skill.
So when a therapist is guiding someone through art making, what are some of the key things they might consider?
Your sources outline several distinctions that can be helpful. These include the frame of the activity.
Like a frame, okay.
Yeah, like what are the boundaries, the source material, what are we working with, the basic qualities of the materials, the tools being used, different shaping strategies, and any specific skills involved. The focus will naturally shift depending on the particular art discipline and the individual's needs.
Well, for example.
For example, in visual arts, you might focus on the color or texture of the paint. In music, it might be the choice of sound source or rhythm. In dance, it could be a specific movement or gesture.
Right, so it's about drawing attention to different aspects of the creative process.
Exactly.
Your reading also introduced this principle of less is more when it comes to artistic assignments.
Less is more. Yes, drawing on Piaget's developmental theories about play, the idea is that sometimes having fewer options or some limitations within the field of play can actually lead to more exploration and discovery.
So you're saying constraints can actually spark creativity?
Your sources use the acronym MORE to
Not
illustrate this.
More, right.
Material. What are we using? Organize. How is it structured? Restrict. What are the limitations? And emerge. What happens as a result?
So I like that more. It's easy to remember.
It is.
So what motivates someone to engage in this kind of artistic exploration in therapy?
Your sources highlight two key modes of fascination exploration, which is about discovering something new and repetition. which is about becoming more familiar with something.
Okay, so you need both.
Yes, and repetition is especially important in the performing arts, where repetition or rehearsal
Right.
is a crucial aesthetic process for shaping the final performance.
Okay.
This idea of focused repetition leads to what's called the work-oriented method of decentering.
Okay. And you also mentioned play and ritual-oriented decentering. How is that different?
Well, in play and ritual-oriented decentering, artistic play becomes a container for exploring deeper, sometimes existential themes.
Okay.
It offers a safe space to experiment with different roles,
Yeah.
narratives, and even the unthinkable.
Right.
Often going beyond typical moralistic judgments. Think of children's imaginative play,
Okay.
where they might act out scary scenarios to process their fears.
Right. It's like they're trying on different possibilities.
Yeah, okay.
Your material then delved into the essentials of a work-oriented didactics
Yes.
based on improvisational performing arts. That sounds quite specific.
It draws on the principles of improvisation in fields like jazz and contemporary theater, ranging from very structured exercises with set patterns to completely free-form explorations.
So there's a whole spectrum there.
There is, and a key element is the creation of improvisational scores.
Improvisational schools.
Yeah, almost like a musical score, but for actions or movements.
Okay.
And then engaging in cycles of takes and feedback using very concrete terminology related to the artistic elements themselves.
So it's about staying grounded in the art form, even while you're exploring these deeper themes.
Yes, and then there's the idea of intermodal work.
Intermodal. Okay, what does that involve?
Intermodal simply means working across different art forms, connecting, for example, visual art with movement,
Okay.
music with writing.
So combining different modalities?
Exactly. The theory behind this is that our imagination operates through different modalities, image, movement, act, word, sound, rhythm, and different art disciplines naturally tap into multiple of these modalities.
Okay.
So combining them can offer richer and more diverse ways of expressing and exploring ourselves.
So it's about expanding the possibilities
Exactly.
in group artistic activities. What are some of the interpersonal dynamics that come into play?
Well, different art forms tend to facilitate different kinds of interactions.
Okay, how
So activities like painting, writing, or sculpting can be more focused on individual expression and individuation, while music often enhances socialization and collaboration.
Okay.
Dance and movement-based activities can be particularly powerful for exploring interpersonal relationships.
Interesting.
Your sources contrast meeting, which is about accepting differences and encountering others authentically, with relationship, which can sometimes involve a pressure to conform.
It's like the difference between really seeing someone for who they are and trying to fit them into a pre-existing mold.
Exactly.
And it's fascinating how artists often talk about limitations actually sparking creativity.
They do.
Your sources touched on that too.
Yes. Artists often approach limitations and resistance not as obstacles to be overcome,
Okay.
but as potential resources for transformation.
So it's about working with what you've got.
Exactly. By working within constraints, you can often find unexpected and innovative solutions.
Now, how does a therapist know if an artistic intervention is actually having an impact?
Well, your readings mentioned aesthetic response and Jenlin's felt sense.
Aesthetic response and felt sense.
Okay, an aesthetic response
Yeah.
is that moment when the art resonates with something within the client.
Okay.
Jenlin's felt sense is this pre-verbal bodily awareness, a quite right feeling or image that emerges and brings with it a noticeable shift in awareness.
So it's not just a thought.
No, it's a deeper, more embodied experience.
Okay.
Bueller called this an aha experience.
That moment of insight.
Exactly. And your sources make a really interesting point about beauty in this context.
Okay.
It's not just about what's pleasant, but can be found even in suffering.
Interesting.
It can attract our attention and empathy without necessarily triggering our defenses, like in the story of Beauty and the Beast.
That's a good example.
So what does responsible participation in the artistic process look like?
Well, I'm curious about that too.
It involves bringing strong attention to the process,
Okay.
a willingness to surrender to the experience, and allowing for a kind of permeability of boundaries between the artist and the emerging artwork.
Okay, so there's a blurring of those lines.
Yes, for the facilitator, aesthetic responsibility means using techniques that help unlock the client's creativity
Right.
and foster their skills in a way that respects the integrity of their process.
Okay, and your readings also touched on countertransference,
Yes.
those unconscious feelings the therapist might project onto the client
Hmm.
in the context of artistic work.
Yes, relational phenomena like countertransference are definitely relevant.
Right.
It's crucial for the therapist to constantly examine their own motivations
Okay.
to ensure they have a genuine, loving affection towards the
Your
emergent.
loving affection towards the
Yeah,
emerger.
towards what the client is creating.
Yeah.
This self-reflection is likened to an art analog, where the
Mhm.
therapist questions their own
Mhm.
impulses and intentions in relation to the artwork.
So when it comes to interpreting the artwork that's created,
Yes.
what's the approach in expressive arts therapy?
The art-based perspective puts the artwork first.
Okay.
It's seen as a kind of gift from the client that requires an exchange or communion.
A gift.
Framing techniques in performance, for example,
Yeah.
help to distinguish between the author or performer
Right.
and the image being presented.
Oh,
and
yeah.
there's this idea of treating the images that emerge as ensouled, carrying their own inherent meaning.
Ensouled.
Yes. Your sources outline 4 levels of aesthetic analysis. Can I briefly describe those?
Yes, please.
The first level is descriptive, simply looking at the concrete surface of the artwork.
Okay.
The second is the process of shaping, exploring the strategies the client used, and any unexpected surprises that occurred. The third is resource-oriented,
Okay.
identifying strengths and abilities that are evident in the art making. And the fourth is connecting with everyday life,
Right.
exploring how the themes and insights from the art relate to the client's experiences outside of therapy.
So you're moving from the concrete to the more symbolic and personal.
Exactly. And throughout this, the thingly engagement,
Interestingly engagement.
yeah, the direct interaction between the client, the facilitator, and the art materials is considered vital.
Right. It's not just about the ideas.
No, it's about that hands-on embodied experience.
Okay, so it sounds like there's a real emphasis on seeing the client's art making in a positive,
There is
resource-oriented way.
absolutely art-oriented decentering is seen not just as a way to explore problems, but also as a coping experience and an access road to resilience.
Access road. I like that.
Even in the initial opening phase of a session, it's important to encourage the client to look at their issues from different angles.
Right.
And then, of course, the session concludes with a clear ending.
Okay.
Sometimes includes homework, drawing on intermodal ideas,
Right.
and an opportunity for evaluation.
Okay. And your reading also touched on how the setting can influence the session and the role of the therapist?
Yes. The structure of a session might differ depending on whether it's an intensive seminar
Okay.
or an ongoing clinical group. Using studio-related language like ensemble or company
Right.
can be helpful in creating a certain kind of atmosphere.
Mm-hmm.
The therapist or change agent balances being an observer
Right.
with the active engagement you'd find in a studio setting. And note-taking is important but should be transparent.
Okay. And how are more challenging situations like crises or conflicts handled in this context?
Well, the overarching view is that peace isn't the absence of conflict,
Right.
but rather the ability to live with it constructively.
Okay.
A crisis is seen as a breakdown of this capacity.
So you're saying it's like losing that ability to navigate conflict effectively.
Exactly. In a crisis, immediate decentering might be needed to shift the situation
Okay.
from overwhelming chaos to a level where it can be engaged with as a conflict.
So bringing it down to a manageable level.
Exactly. And a key principle to remember is the guiding principle of language.
Okay, guiding principle of
And
language.
even when exploring these alternative worlds through art, it's still connected to the client's
Right.
everyday life and experiences.
Okay, so it's not about escaping reality.
No, it's about using art to gain a new perspective on it.
Right.
The choice to engage in art-based decentering is a critical moment